Hello everyone, welcome to the channel. Before we dive into today's case, I'd like to ask for your support by subscribing to the channel. Your subscription is very important to us, so please hit that subscribe button, give this video a like, and let's get into the case for O. The morning air was crisp as I stood in the garden, the sun barely peeking over the horizon, casting long shadows across the rows of tomatoes and squash. I could smell the earth, the rich, damp scent of the soil that had been nourished by months of careful tending. My hands moved mechanically, pulling weeds from the ground, the routine comforting in its familiarity. There was something peaceful about working in my garden, the world quiet except for the occasional chirp of birds and the rustling of leaves in the wind. I had lived in this rural part of Montana for nearly 5 years, far enough away from town to escape the noise of the world, but close enough to visit when I needed supplies. It was a simple life, one I'd chosen after leaving behind the chaos of city living. The isolation suited me, and I'd grown accustomed to the occasional sighting of deer, elk, and even coyotes. But there was something about being so close to nature, to the wilderness, that felt more real to me than any human-made world ever could. My knees ached as I bent down to pull another weed from the ground, my back protesting slightly as I reached deeper into the soil. The garden was full of life today. The sun, the breeze, the plants that had flourished under my care. I was lost in the rhythm of it, the simplicity of just existing in the moment. Then everything shifted. A crack, sharp, unmistakable, pierced the silence. The sound wasn't natural. It wasn't a twig breaking from the wind or a branch swaying under the weight of a bird. No, this was something else. It was the unmistakable snap of a large object being disturbed, followed by the soft rustle of movement. Heavy, deliberate. I froze, my heart suddenly thudding in my chest. Something wasn't right. I knew it before I even turned to look, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up in warning. For a moment, everything went still. I strained my ears, trying to hear the faint sounds of the wind or the birds again, but there was nothing. The garden, once peaceful, had become unnervingly quiet. My fingers tightened around the handle of my trowel, my body instinctively going on alert. I could feel the hairs on my arms rise. I turned slowly, my body rigid, with tension, and that's when I saw it. A massive grizzly bear emerged from the tree line, its dark eyes locked onto me. Its fur was thick, matted in some places, and its massive shoulders heaved with every step it took toward me. For a moment I simply stared, my mind struggling to comprehend the sight in front of me. It felt like a scene from a nightmare, too surreal to be real. The bear didn't hesitate. It wasn't curious or cautious, as I'd heard they sometimes were. No, this bear was focused, its every step calculated and confident. My breath caught in my throat as I felt an overwhelming sense of danger wash over me. I couldn't move, couldn't think. The bear's eyes didn't leave mine. Its steps, slow but purposeful. Instinct kicked in, and I tried to back away, but I was too slow. The bear, much faster than I had imagined, lunged at me with terrifying speed. I barely had time to raise my arm to protect myself before the bear's massive paw connected with my side, sending me crashing to the ground. Pain exploded in my side, sharp and searing, like something was tearing through me. I screamed, the sound ragged and desperate, but it did nothing to stop the beast. The weight of its body was crushing me as I fought to breathe, its claws digging into my skin, ripping through my flesh. I could feel blood oozing from my side, the warm, sticky sensation spreading across my skin. The bear's hot breath was on my face, its growl low and menacing as it pushed against me. My heart pounded in my chest, every beat loud and deafening. I tried to move, to push the bear off, but my body was too weak, too overwhelmed by the pain. My vision blurred, but I could still make out the massive form of the bear looming over me, its sharp claws ready to strike again. It was then that something in the bear shifted. It stopped, its weight lessening for just a moment. I took a shuddering breath, too terrified to even think clearly. My survival instincts screamed at me to run, but I knew I couldn't. Not now. Not with the bear so close. I pushed myself up with what little strength I had left, the pain in my side almost unbearable. My hands were slick with blood, my legs trembling beneath me. I couldn't let it happen again. I couldn't stay here. The bear's eyes followed my every movement, its head tilting slightly as if considering its next move. I stumbled backward, the gravel beneath my feet loose and unstable, but I didn't care. I needed to get to the house. My mind screamed at me to run, but my legs felt like lead. my movements slow and painful. The bear watched me, unmoving, as I crawled my way toward the house. I barely registered the feeling of the earth against my hands as I pulled myself forward, dragging my body inch by inch. The pain in my side was a constant, unbearable throb, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. I reached the porch, my hands barely able to grasp the railing as I pulled myself up. With one final effort, I forced my body to climb the steps, reaching for the door handle. I fumbled with it, the blood from my side staining the wood of the door, my vision spinning. I managed to get the door open just enough to slip inside, slamming it shut behind me. I didn't even look back. I just locked the door and slid down to the floor, my heart racing in my chest. The silence that followed was deafening. The only sound in the room was my ragged breathing and the beating of my heart. I could still hear the bear outside growling low, but it was moving away. It wasn't interested in me anymore. I pressed my hand to my side, the blood slick against my palm, and tried to focus on breathing. My thoughts were scattered too, chaotic to process. I needed help. I needed to get out of here, but the pain was overwhelming. And in that moment, I realized something terrifying. I had no idea what to do next. The morning passed in a haze, my body aching from the impact of the bear's attack. The adrenaline had worn off, leaving me exhausted and trembling. I was still on the floor of the living room, every inch of me protesting the movement, but I couldn't let myself stay there. I needed help. My phone was charging in the kitchen, just out of reach, but I had to get to it. I pushed myself up, gritting my teeth against the pain that shot through my side. My fingers were slick with blood as I grabbed the edge of the couch, pulling myself to my feet. The room spun for a moment, my vision flickering at the edges, but I shook it off. I had no time for dizziness. I had to call someone who could help me. The phone was just a few steps away. I made my way slowly, dragging my feet, focusing on the hum of my breath. The pain was unbearable, but I had no choice. The kitchen counter loomed before me, and I gripped it to steady myself, my hand leaving bloody smears on the white countertop. Finally, I reached the phone. I fumbled for a moment, my fingers uncoordinated from the shock. It took what felt like forever, but I finally managed to unlock it and dial 911. I held the phone to my ear, but all I could hear was the steady ringing. My pulse was pounding in my ears, drowning out everything else. 911, what's your emergency? A voice finally answered. The words barely made it past my lips. I've been attacked by a bear in my garden, but I'm in Montana on a rural property near... Ma'am, slow down. Are you injured? The operator interrupted, their voice calm, almost mechanical. Yes, I'm hurt. I need help. My breath hitched, and I could feel the tears threatening to spill, but I didn't let them fall. I needed to stay strong. All right, stay with me, ma'am. Help is on the way. I need you to tell me exactly where you are. Can you give me your address? I gave her the information, my voice cracking with each word. She reassured me that help would be there soon, but time seemed to slow to a crawl as I waited, clutching the phone to my ear as though it were a lifeline. Every minute that passed felt like an eternity. I didn't want to think about the bear. I didn't want to remember its eyes or the feel of its claws digging into my skin. The memory was too fresh, too real. My mind kept replaying the attack, over and over. The way it had charged at me, how quickly it had knocked me to the ground. I couldn't stop seeing it. The operator stayed on the line with me, but I could barely hear her anymore. My thoughts were consumed by the pain in my side, by the slow realization that I'd never be the same again. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. My body had no energy left for anything but surviving. At some point, the sounds of sirens pierced the air. I strained my ears, hearing the distant wail growing louder, and then I heard the crunch of tires on gravel. The rescue crew had arrived. I managed to stand up, stumbling toward the door, barely able to lift my feet. The paramedics burst through the door just as I opened it. They were quick, efficient, their faces a mix of professional concern and calm reassurance. One of them, a tall man with dark hair, knelt beside me and looked over my wounds. "Ma'am, we're going to get you some help, okay?" he said, his voice soft but firm. I nodded, too weak to say anything in response. The pain in my side was too much to form words. They carefully examined my injury, one of the paramedics gently probing the gash with gloved hands. It felt like fire in my flesh. "This is deep. We'll need to get you to the hospital right away," the woman paramedic said, her tone decisive. I didn't even see it coming. I mumbled, feeling my chest tighten with panic. The reality of it all was sinking in. The bear, the attack. My life was never going to be the same again. The man placed a reassuring hand on my shoulder. "You're safe now, we've got you." They carefully lifted me onto a stretcher, and I was wheeled out of the house, the cool air hitting my face as we passed through the front door. The pain in my side was sharp and unrelenting, but I tried to keep breathing steadily. The world was moving in slow motion, everything distant and dreamlike as the paramedics loaded me into the ambulance. The ride to the hospital was a blur of flashing lights and muffled voices. I could barely keep my eyes open, my body aching. With each jolt of the vehicle, I didn't even remember the ride that well. It was like my mind had shut down, protecting me from the pain, from the horror. At the hospital, they rushed me into an emergency room. I was surrounded by doctors and nurses, all of them working quickly. They gave me pain medication, and the world around me began to soften, the edges blurring as they stitched up my wounds and patched me together. I was barely aware of the conversation around me. "This is a nasty wound," one of the doctors said, her voice professional but tinged with concern. "It's going to leave a scar, but we'll take care of it." I could only nod, too exhausted to do anything else. Eventually, the hours passed. I was stitched up and bandaged, but the emotional toll weighed heavier on me than the physical injuries. I kept hearing the bear's growls in my mind, its massive body towering over me. I could still feel its claws raking across my flesh, a memory that wouldn't fade. The next morning I was awake, groggy and tired, but the worst of the pain had subsided. I was discharged from the hospital, my body still sore but functional. My wounds were dressed and the doctor explained the care I would need to take in the coming weeks. The physical damage was something I could recover from, but the mental scars, those would take longer. A sheriff's deputy came to speak with me later that afternoon. He had a notebook in his hands, and his demeanor was professional, but there was a certain coldness in his eyes. He asked me to recount what happened, and I did, my voice shaky as I told him everything. How the bear had come from the trees, how it had knocked me down, and how I had crawled back to the house. "That's all we need," he said, scribbling. "A few notes. We'll pass this along to the park rangers. They'll keep an eye on the area." "That's it?" I asked, confused and frustrated. I expected more, a full investigation, something, but the deputy just nodded. "It happens sometimes. Bears wander into populated areas. They don't usually stay long. We'll keep an eye on it." He left shortly after, and I was left alone with the reality that nothing much would change. The bear was gone. The attack was over, but the scars, both on my body and in my mind, would stay with me. I spent the rest of the day in a fog, too tired to care much about the details. There would be no grand investigation, no dramatic resolution. The bear had walked away, and so had the rest of the world. It would be nothing more than a story, something people would talk about for a while before moving on. But for me, it was everything. The days that followed blurred together. I couldn't keep track of time. Everything felt muffled and slow, as if I were moving through thick fog. The pain in my side was constant, but it had settled into a dull throb, a reminder that my life had shifted in ways I couldn't yet fully grasp. Every movement reminded me of the attack, the way the bear's claws had slashed through my skin, tearing me open in ways that felt impossible to heal. I spent most of my days in bed, not because I had to, but because I didn't know what else to do. I didn't want to be outside. The thought of walking through the yard, even stepping out onto the porch, made my chest tighten. The house had once been my sanctuary, my escape from the world, but now it felt like a trap. Every noise, every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind outside made my heart race. I couldn't shake the feeling that the bear was still out, there watching me, waiting for the right moment to strike again. The first night after I returned from the hospital, I tried to sleep, but sleep was elusive, slipping just beyond my reach, taunting me with its distance. The bear's face kept replaying in my mind, the gleam in its eyes, the way it had moved toward me with such quiet purpose. I would close my eyes and see its silhouette against the trees, hear its growl rumbling in the silence of the garden. I had to do something. I couldn't let this fear rule me. I couldn't let it take away the life I had spent years building in this quiet corner of Montana. But what could I do? The bear was still out there, and if it could find me once, it could find me again. The next morning, I forced myself to get out of bed. The house felt smaller now, as though the walls were closing in on me. My side ached when I moved, but it was manageable. I wrapped a towel around my shoulder and padded into the kitchen. the familiar creak of the old wooden floor beneath my feet offering a sense of comfort, however fleeting. I had coffee brewing on the stove when there was a knock at the door. I froze. My heart skipped a beat, and for a moment I thought my mind had conjured up the sound. But then the knock came again, more urgent this time. I moved slowly, my legs stiff from staying in bed for so long. When I reached the door, I hesitated. The idea of facing anyone right now was unbearable, but I knew I couldn't hide forever. I didn't want to. With a deep breath, I opened the door. A man in a park ranger uniform stood on the other side. His face was weathered, his eyes sharp beneath the brim of his hat. "Morning, ma'am," he said, tipping his hat slightly. "Name's Joe Miller. I'm with the Park Service. I heard about the bear attack. I just wanted to check on you, make sure you're doing all right." I stared at him for a moment, surprised by his visit. I wasn't sure what I had expected, but it wasn't this. I was thankful for it, though. At least he wasn't an officer who was just doing his job. He looked like he cared. Yeah, I'm doing all right," I said, my voice hoarse. "Just trying to get back to normal, I guess." Joe nodded, his expression sympathetic. "I understand. It's not easy to come back from something like that. That bear's been active in the area for a while now. We've had reports from a few other folks. Nothing like yours, but it's been causing a bit of a stir. It's likely that it's hungry and looking for easy food sources." "I never thought it would come that close," I muttered, shaking my head. The memory of the bear charging at me, the terror, the helplessness, it was still so vivid, so fresh. I could still feel its weight on top of me, the fear suffocating me as I tried to push it away. Unfortunately, bears don't always follow the rules. They're unpredictable. "But we'll make sure to keep an eye out," Joe said. "We're setting up some new bear-safe bins around the area, trying to keep them from coming into town too often. But in the meantime, I'd recommend being extra cautious when you're outside, especially in the early morning or evening. And you've got to secure your trash better. Anything you're leaving outside could attract them." I didn't even think about that," I whispered. I was in my garden. I didn't think it would be that close, that aggressive." "I understand," Joe said, giving me a kind smile. "It happens. You've got some fresh wounds there. I'd recommend getting them checked out by a doctor, just to make sure they're healing well. And maybe stay inside for a while. Keep your distance from the areas where you've seen the bear. You might want to think about carrying some bear spray when you're outside, too." "I'll do that. Thank you," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Joe gave me one last nod before turning to leave. As he walked back toward his truck, I watched him go, the weight of his words sinking in. I had a lot to think about, more than I cared to. I didn't want to stay inside forever, locked away from the world, but the fear, God, the fear, it was so real. I wasn't sure how to handle it, how to face the quiet garden that used to bring me peace, how to return to my normal life when everything had been shattered in an instant. After Joe left, I made my way to the kitchen and stood by the window, staring out at the garden. The trees were still, the wind barely a whisper. Through the branches, everything seemed so ordinary, so peaceful, yet I knew better now. I knew what lurked just beyond the trees. I wasn't sure how long I stood there, lost in thought, before I noticed the shadows beginning to stretch longer across the yard. The sun was dipping low in the sky, casting an eerie glow over everything. I shivered. The fear gnawed at me. It wasn't just the memory of the bear. It was the uncertainty, the sense that my life had shifted, that things would never be the same. That bear was out there, somewhere, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it was waiting for me to make a mistake. I grabbed my jacket, my heart hammering in my chest. I had to face it. I had to. I couldn't keep running from this. I stepped. Outside, my hand shaking slightly as I reached for the door. The garden, my garden, lay ahead of me, quiet and still. But I knew better than to trust the silence. I had to be careful. I had to stay vigilant. With one last look at the empty yard, I took a step forward, and then another. Each one felt like an eternity, but I kept moving, knowing that I couldn't stay hidden forever. I wouldn't let the bear have that kind of control over me. I'd barely managed to make it through the day when I found myself standing at the back door of my house, staring out at the garden. It was early evening, the sky painted in soft purples and oranges, and everything seemed still, almost too still. The rustling of the wind through the trees was absent, and the chirping of the birds had fallen silent. It was as though the world was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I hated it. The quiet had never felt more suffocating. I had hoped the decision to go outside would help. I thought maybe I could reclaim some sense of normalcy, maybe face the garden again and not feel that gnawing fear in the pit of my stomach. But as I stepped onto the porch, I felt it again. The tension, the unease. My legs were shaky, my breath shallow, and every shadow felt like a warning. The garden stretched before me, the same rows of tomatoes and squash, the familiar patches of green. But to me, it looked entirely different now. The memories of the bear, its growls, its eyes, the way its claws had sunk into my side, rushed back with a violent force. My heart pounded in my chest, and for a moment, I was paralyzed, frozen in place. I had thought the worst of it had passed. The physical pain, the hospital visit, the questions from the sheriff's deputy, but the mental scars, they were much deeper, and I didn't know how to fix them. I glanced around, trying to steady myself. I had to face this. I had to get back to my life. I had always been independent, living here alone in this remote part of Montana because I loved the solitude. I loved the quiet, but now it felt like a prison I had built for myself. Just breathe, I muttered under my breath, the words coming out more as a plea than anything else. I could hear the faint rustling of leaves as a breeze picked up, and for the first time in hours I felt a bit of relief. Maybe I could do this. Maybe the bear wasn't coming back. Maybe I could move on. But then I heard it. A snap. A loud crack of a branch. My heart skipped a beat. My breath hitched. I stood there, paralyzed again, my gaze locked on the trees at the edge of the yard. It was too much like that moment, when the bear had emerged from the woods. I could see it so clearly in my mind, those eyes, that predatory gaze fixed on me. I took a step backward, instinctively pulling the door closer to me, but I didn't want to retreat. I couldn't. I wasn't going to let it control me like this. I squinted, trying to make out the shape in the distance. The shadows were thickening, now the sun dipping lower in the sky. There was no movement, just the eerie stillness. Was it the wind, or was I imagining it? The sound came again, this time louder, and then a rustle of leaves. My pulse surged and I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. This wasn't my imagination. Something was out there. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding small, shaky. "Who's there?" I regretted it immediately. I knew the answer. If anyone was out there, it wasn't a person. It couldn't be. Not in the wilderness this far out. The only creatures out here were wildlife. The same wildlife I had always lived in harmony with. But now I wasn't so sure. The bear had changed everything. I stood there for what felt like hours, trying to make sense of the sounds, my mind racing. Maybe it was just a deer, or maybe a coyote. Something harmless. Something that wouldn't make my heart thud in my chest like a drum. But no matter how I tried to reason with myself, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there. Something watching me. I took a deep breath and forced myself to step off the porch, my feet heavy as I walked toward the garden. Each step felt like I was walking toward my own doom, but I couldn't turn back. Not now. Not after everything I'd been through. I needed to know what was out there. As I moved closer to the garden, I felt the air shift, the pressure building. My instincts screamed at me to turn around and run back inside, but my feet carried me forward. I had to know. I reached the edge of the garden. The rows of plants stretched before me like some kind of twisted mirage. I peered into the trees, but the shadows were deep, and I couldn't make out any shapes. Just darkness, just the promise of something lurking in the unknown. Then a rustling again, much closer now. My heart stopped in my chest. There, just beyond the line of trees, something shifted. Something massive. I could make out a dark shape moving through the underbrush, its bulk too large to be a deer, too deliberate to be anything else. A bear. The familiar fear surged through me, spreading like wildfire through my veins. I froze, not knowing whether to run or stay still. I felt paralyzed, my mind unable to process what was happening. The bear was close, too close. It moved with purpose, its massive form cutting through the trees. I could see its dark fur, its hulking shape, and my breath hitched. My legs felt like lead, but it wasn't charging. No, it was just walking, moving through the trees at a slow, steady pace. I couldn't see its eyes, but I knew deep in my bones that it was the same bear. It was back. It was here again. The bear paused, and for a moment I thought it had spotted me. My heart raced and I wanted to scream, to run, but my feet wouldn't move. I couldn't breathe. But then, to my shock, the bear turned, seemingly uninterested in me. It didn't charge, it didn't roar. It just walked away, disappearing into the trees with the same eerie calm it had shown before. I stood there, frozen, for what felt like an eternity. My mind was racing. Had I imagined it? Had I done something to spook it? Or had it simply lost interest? I didn't know. After what felt like a lifetime, I forced myself to take a breath. Then another. I couldn't believe what had just happened. The bear had walked away. It wasn't interested in me anymore, at least not in that moment. I slowly turned and walked back toward the house, my body trembling, my heart still pounding, in my chest. I had survived again, but the terror I felt in that moment stayed with me, the fear that it could happen again, and deep down, I knew something I couldn't ignore. The bear wasn't done with me. It might not be today or tomorrow, but it would be back. It always came back. The days after the second encounter felt longer than they should have. I kept myself busy, doing anything I could to distract myself, but nothing worked. The memory of the bear and the terror I felt every time I stepped outside weighed on me. The house, the yard, everything that had once been so familiar now felt like a threat, an open invitation for something dangerous to return. I thought I could handle it. I thought the fear would fade, that with time I could return to the life I had before, but I was wrong. I couldn't stop looking over my shoulder, couldn't shake the images of the bear's eyes, its claws. I couldn't even go out to the garden without feeling my heart race, my palms sweat, and my legs threatened to collapse beneath me. It wasn't just the bear anymore, it was everything. The vulnerability of being alone out here, so far from help, the knowledge that I couldn't defend myself if something happened again. I'd locked myself inside for days, trying to ignore the panic that settled into my chest every time I heard a sound outside, every time a branch cracked in the distance. I couldn't breathe, I couldn't move. I was trapped inside my own home, my own mind. The phone rang on the fourth day. I hadn't been expecting it, hadn't even noticed it sitting there on the counter until the harsh ring broke through. The silence. My hands trembled as I reached for it, unsure if I even wanted to answer. Who would be calling now? Hello? My voice sounded weaker than I'd expected. My throat was dry, cracked from too many nights of restless sleep, and my body felt heavy like I hadn't moved in days. Susan? The voice on the other end was unfamiliar, but it had an authority to it, a kind of calm that settled over me despite my unease. This is Joe Miller, the park ranger. I just wanted to check in and see how you're doing after the attack. The bear, the attack. The thought hit me like a punch to the stomach. I hadn't realized how much I'd pushed everything aside until that moment. I'm fine, I lied, my voice shaky as I spoke. Just trying to keep busy. Get back to normal, you know. There was a pause on the other end, a moment of silence that felt heavier than it should have. I understand, I know it's not easy. That bear's been moving around the area more, and we've been keeping an eye on it. I'm just calling to check in. Make sure you're not going outside too much. I'm not, I said quickly. The last thing I wanted was to be out there, exposed, vulnerable again. I'm staying inside, keeping the doors locked. I hesitated, my words catching in my throat. I don't feel safe anymore. I don't know if I can go back outside. Joe's voice softened. Susan, I understand more than you know. I know what it's like to feel that way, but I'm telling you it's important that you get outside eventually. You can't keep hiding forever. I'm not hiding, I snapped before I could stop myself. I'm just being cautious. I didn't mean to upset you, Joe said quickly. But listen, if you need anything or if you want me to come out and check on you, just say the word. I sat there in silence for a moment, the phone pressed to my ear. What was I supposed to say? That I was too terrified to go outside? That the garden I used to love now felt like a battleground? That I couldn't get the image of that bear's eyes out of my mind? I'll be fine, I finally said, trying to steady my voice. I just need some time. Joe didn't push me further, thankfully. He gave me a few more words of reassurance and then ended the call. I sat there for a long while afterward, the phone still clutched in my hand. His voice had been calm, steady, and yet it only served to remind me of how far from safe I felt, how far I'd drifted from the life I once had. It wasn't long after that the house felt too small again. The walls seemed to close in on me, the stillness of the place growing more unbearable with every passing hour. The thought of stepping outside, of confronting the garden, the yard, the forest beyond, terrified me more than I cared to admit. But I couldn't stay inside forever. I had to try. I had to take control back. The alternative was just letting the fear swallow me whole. The next morning, I forced myself to move. I put on my boots, my coat, and stepped outside onto the porch. The cold air bit at my skin, a sharp contrast to the warmth of the house I had just left behind. I stood there for a moment, breathing in the air, trying to calm my racing heart. The world around me was quiet, too quiet, but at least I could hear the sounds of the wind through the trees, the distant calls of birds. It was peaceful in its own way. But then I saw it, a flash of dark brown moving quickly through the trees. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. For a moment I thought it was the bear, that it had returned, but then I realized it was something else. A deer. I exhaled in relief, but the tightness in my chest didn't ease. I'd seen too many signs of the bear already. The way it moved, the way it watched me. The fear had dug in so deep that even a small movement in the woods now made me jump. I walked down the porch steps and toward the garden, my steps hesitant, my body tense. Every rustling leaf, every crack in the ground beneath my boots had me on edge. I kept expecting to hear the bear's growl, to see it burst out of the trees, charging at me again, but it never came. I reached the edge of the garden and stopped, staring at the rows of plants. Everything looked the same as it always had, untouched, except for the faint marks of my earlier panic, the uneven soil, the way the plants had been disrupted when I'd run for the house. I knelt down and gently started to pull a few weeds. My movements slow and deliberate. Each task felt like a small victory. Each movement toward normalcy an act of defiance against the fear that tried to take over. But as I worked, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The air felt heavier now, and the silence of the woods seemed to stretch on for too long. Something wasn't right. I stood up, looking around, and that's when I saw it again. A dark shape moving through the trees, much closer this time. The bear. It wasn't as close as the last time, but it was still there, watching, waiting. My heart stopped in my chest, and every ounce of courage I had built up in the last hour evaporated in an instant. I stood frozen, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The bear didn't move, it just stared at me from the tree line. This time, though, it didn't charge, it didn't roar. It simply turned and disappeared back into the woods, its massive form vanishing into the shadows. I stood there, my body trembling, and for a long moment I couldn't move, I couldn't breathe. The bear had left, but somehow I knew it would return, and when it did, I wouldn't be ready. I turned and quickly made my way back toward the house, slamming the door behind me. My hands were shaking, my chest tight. The house felt like my only sanctuary now, but I knew it wasn't enough. It wasn't safe enough. Not anymore. The bear was out there, and it would always find its way back. And I had no idea how to prepare for that. I had stopped counting the days. They all seemed to blend together, one indistinguishable from the next. After the bear had left me the last time, I thought I could finally breathe. I tried to convince myself that it was over, that it had moved on, but I knew deep down that it wasn't true. I could feel its presence even when I wasn't outside, an invisible weight that settled in the pit of my stomach every time I looked out the window. It wasn't a matter of if the bear would return, it was when. The days passed in uneasy silence. Then I stayed inside more than I ever had, retreating into my house like a prisoner. I told myself I was being smart, being cautious, but the truth was, I was terrified. The thought of stepping outside, even for something as simple as gathering the mail or walking to the shed, filled me with dread. The house, once a sanctuary, had become a cage. I hadn't seen the bear again, not up close at least, but I kept hearing things. The distant rustle of leaves, the snap of a branch, a low growl that made my blood run cold, even though I couldn't be sure of its origin. It was enough to keep me in a constant state of alert. My eyes were always scanning. The trees, the yard, the shadows that stretched across the land. The phone call came just as I was starting to prepare dinner. I was chopping vegetables, my mind occupied with the mundane task, when the shrill ring of the phone startled me. I glanced over at the counter, my stomach tightening. I picked it up, pressing it to my ear. "Hello? Susan, it's Joe Miller again, the park ranger." I instantly felt my pulse quicken. "Joe, what is it? Is everything all right?" There was a brief pause before Joe's voice came back, much softer now, almost sympathetic. "I'm afraid we've had some reports of the bear being spotted near your property again. Not exactly close to your house, but it's in the area. I wanted to give you a heads up in case you were planning on going outside." I felt a cold wave of fear wash over me. The bear. It was back. I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to steady my breath. How close is it? How far from here? It's still a few miles out, Joe said, his tone even. But the way the bear has been moving, it's getting closer to the town. We're keeping a watch on it, but I thought you should know. If you're planning to go out, be cautious. And don't go alone if you can avoid it. I haven't been going anywhere, I said, forcing the words out. I haven't even stepped outside. I'm just trying to stay safe. Smart, Joe said. We'll keep monitoring the situation. If it gets too close, we'll take action. But for now, just stay vigilant. I'll check in with you again soon. I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. Thanks, Joe. I'll be careful. Please let me know if you hear anything else. After hanging up, I stood in the kitchen, the phone still gripped in my hand. The calm reassurance from Joe did little to ease the fear gnawing at my insides. I hadn't seen the bear for days, but knowing it was out there again, somewhere nearby, made it all feel too real. The unease, the dread, returned with full force. My hands shook as I set the phone down on the counter. I thought about what Joe had said, stay vigilant. How could I? How could I live like this, constantly looking over my shoulder, never feeling safe in my own home? The bear wasn't just a physical threat. It had invaded my mind, and no amount of caution could make that go away. That night, sleep didn't come easily. The darkness felt heavier than it used to, the shadows too thick to trust. I tossed and turned, my body tangled in the sheets, my mind racing. Every sound, every creak of the floor, every gust of wind outside sent me into a panic. I couldn't tell if I was hearing the bear again or if it was just my imagination, but either way, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Around 2 a.m., I finally gave up. I couldn't stay in bed any longer. I needed to move, to do something. I crept downstairs as quietly as I could, trying not to wake anyone, but there was no one to wake. It was just me, alone. I made my way to the kitchen, staring out the window into the dark yard. The moonlight barely illuminated the trees, casting long, eerie shadows across the ground. My eyes searched the forest line, scanning for any sign of movement. I didn't know what I was looking for, but I couldn't stop. The fear was overwhelming, and all I could do was wait for something, anything to happen. It was then that I heard it, a faint rustling just beyond the trees. My heart leaped into my throat. I held my breath, straining my ears. There it was again, soft, deliberate, the unmistakable sound of something large moving through the brush. I couldn't tell if it was the bear or something else, but I knew I couldn't stay here. My mind raced as I backed away from the window, my hands gripping the counter so tightly that my knuckles turned white. I had to do something. I grabbed my phone and dialed Joe's number without thinking. The phone rang twice before he picked up. "Joe," I whispered, my voice trembling. "It's happening again. The bear's out there. I heard it." There was a moment of silence before Joe spoke. His voice was calm, but there was a new edge to it, a sense of urgency that hadn't been there before. "Stay inside, Susan. Don't go outside. I'm calling for a team to come out and check on you. Please hurry," I whispered, my breath shallow. I'm so scared. "You're safe inside, Susan. Just stay there. Don't open any doors or windows. Help is on the way." I hung up quickly and ran to the back door, locking it with trembling hands. I could hear the rustling again, closer now, and it was like the air had thickened. My chest felt tight, and my heart hammered in my ribcage. I backed away from the door, every nerve in my body on high alert. My mind kept flashing back to the attack, how it had come out of nowhere, how it had overpowered me in seconds. What if it happened again? What if I wasn't strong enough to survive it this time? The minutes ticked by slowly. I could hear the bear moving around outside. Closer, closer. I wanted to scream, to call for help again, but all I could do was wait. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the rustling stopped. The silence returned, heavy and oppressive. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my eyes fixed on the back door, waiting for something to happen, anything to happen. Finally, I heard the sound of tires crunching on gravel, distant but growing louder. Relief flooded through me. Help had arrived. I took a shaky breath and walked to the door, my legs weak beneath me. I opened it slowly, peering out into the yard. There was no sign of the bear, but I knew it was out there somewhere, watching, waiting. Joe and a team of rangers arrived moments later, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. They spread out, checking the yard and the surrounding forest for any sign of the bear. But by the time they arrived, it was already gone. It had vanished back into the woods. I stood there, feeling the weight of the fear and the uncertainty that had taken root in me. The bear was gone for now, but I knew it wouldn't be the last time it came. The days after the ranger team left felt like a slow recovery from a nightmare. Despite their assurances, I couldn't shake the fear that had settled deep inside me. The bear was still out there somewhere, and I wasn't sure how to live with that knowledge. It was one thing to be terrified in the moment of an attack, but it was another to know that the threat was always lurking just beyond the tree line. I tried to go back to a semblance of normal life. I did the dishes, cleaned the house, even went through the motions of tending to the garden. But nothing felt the same. Every noise, every rustle of the wind made my heart race. The familiar sound of birds singing was now tainted, as if I was waiting for the next interruption. The growl of a bear, the crunch of branches under heavy paws. I couldn't get the sound of the bear's low growls out of my mind. The worst part was how alone I felt. Sure, there were people in town, but they didn't understand. No one could except maybe Joe. I had called him a few times since the last encounter, mostly to hear his voice to get a reassurance that I wasn't imagining things. He told me that the bear was still moving around, staying near the woods and the outskirts of town, but it hadn't approached any houses since the last report. Yet that didn't bring me any comfort. It only reminded me that it could come back at any moment, without warning. I was sitting at the kitchen table late one evening, staring out the window. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, leaving the yard in deep shadows. The wind had picked up again, and I could hear it rattling the branches of the trees. My eyes wandered to the line of woods at the edge of the property, and for a moment I thought I saw something move, a dark shape that barely shifted in the fading light. My breath caught in my throat, and I leaned forward, squinting into the shadows. I wasn't sure if I had imagined it, but something was definitely out there. The rustling stopped, and I waited, watching. Nothing happened. I shook my head, trying to steady myself. It was just my nerves. The wind, the trees. There was nothing there. I turned my attention back to the table, trying to ignore the gnawing anxiety in my chest. But the unease wouldn't let up. I hadn't heard from Joe in a couple of days, and I found myself dialing his number without thinking. It rang 3 times before he answered. "Susan?" His voice was calm, but there was a note of concern beneath it. "Everything okay?" "I don't know," I replied, my voice quivering. "I thought I saw something moving, out there in the woods. But when I looked again, it was gone. I'm not sure if I'm seeing things or if the bear is back." There was a pause on the other end. "It's probably nothing, Susan. You're still on edge from everything. But I'll come by tomorrow to check the area again, just to be sure. You're safe in there, right?" "Yeah," I said, though I wasn't sure I believed it. "I'm safe. I don't know what to do anymore." "You're doing the right thing by staying inside," Joe reassured me. "Look, I'll swing by in the morning, and we'll take a walk around the property. We'll make sure everything's secure. It's important to keep your distance from the woods, especially if you're not feeling right about it. But don't worry, we've got this." I appreciated the reassurance, but the fear still hung over me, a constant presence. After ending the call, I walked to the back door and stood there for a moment, looking out into the darkening yard. My eyes kept darting to the tree line, convinced I'd see movement. But the night remained still, too still. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. The next morning, Joe showed up as promised. He parked his truck by the side of the house and walked up the path to the porch, his boots crunching on the gravel. I opened the door to find him standing there with a slight smile, though his eyes were guarded, as if he could sense the tension in the air. "Morning, Susan," he greeted, giving me a quick nod. "How are you holding up?" I'm getting by," I said, forcing a smile. "But I don't know if I'm ever going to feel normal again. It's like the bear's always there, even when I'm inside." Joe nodded understandingly. "I get it, but we're going to do what we can to make sure it doesn't. Come back. I'll walk around the property with you and we'll check the perimeter. Make sure there's no sign of the bear. I know it's been a lot to handle." I stepped outside with him, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling that twisted in my gut. I followed him down the steps and toward the edge of the yard where the trees began. The wind was calm this morning, but every sound seemed amplified, every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves making my heart jump. Joe scanned the area, his eyes moving methodically from the trees to the ground, looking for any sign of the bear. He walked toward the edge of the tree line and paused, bending down to inspect something on the ground. I moved closer, my pulse racing. "What is it?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Joe didn't answer right away. He squatted down and gently brushed away some fallen leaves, revealing a set of large, deep paw prints in the soft earth. They were fresh, the edges of the prints still sharp and distinct. "Looks like it was here recently," he said, standing up and glancing back at me. "Maybe last night." I felt a cold rush of fear shoot through me. "Is it coming back?" "It's hard to say," Joe replied, standing up straight. "It could just be passing through looking for food. Bears often cover large areas in search of food, but they usually avoid human homes if they don't feel threatened." "But it's been here before," I said, my voice trembling. "It knows where I am." Joe gave me a reassuring look, though I could see the worry in his eyes. "We'll set up some more bear-safe bins for food and trash, and I'll leave a couple of trail cameras in the area. That way, if it comes back, we'll know. But for now, we just have to stay vigilant and not let fear control us." I nodded, but deep down I knew it wasn't that simple. The bear wasn't just a threat, it was a shadow that loomed over me, reminding me of how fragile everything was. I couldn't just go on with my life as if nothing had happened, not when the bear was still out there circling my home. As we walked back toward the house, I couldn't shake the feeling that the bear wasn't done with me yet. It wasn't a matter of if, but when, and when it came, I had no idea if I would be ready. Joe left after a while, assuring me that he would keep in touch and that I could call him any time. I watched him drive away, the truck disappearing down the road, and felt the familiar weight of fear settle back in. The bear was still out there, and nothing, no matter how many precautions I took, could change that. It was only a matter of time before it came back, and when it did, I wasn't sure I would be able to survive it again. The next few days were a strange kind of limbo. The bear had been spotted again, further north, and the rangers had set up more traps, but the worry still gnawed at me, an undercurrent that wouldn't let up. Joe had been by a few times, checking the trail cameras and making sure everything around the house was secure, but despite his efforts, the fear didn't subside. If anything, it only deepened. The more precautions I took, the more I felt trapped. The house was safe, but the land around it was no longer something I could trust. I wasn't just afraid of the bear anymore. I was afraid of the life I had lost, the freedom I had once felt here. It was late afternoon when I noticed it, an odd silence. The birds had stopped singing and the wind had died down, leaving the air unnaturally still. I was sitting at the kitchen table, looking out over the yard, when I saw movement at the edge of the trees. My breath caught in my throat and my heart skipped a beat. At first I thought it was just a trick of the light, a shifting shadow, but then it came again, unmistakable this time. Something large, dark, moving slowly through the trees. My pulse quickened, and I stood up, my legs shaky as I moved toward the window. I couldn't believe what I was seeing, but I couldn't look away either. The bear. It was back. I fumbled for my phone and dialed Joe's number, my fingers trembling. It rang once, twice before he picked up. "Joe, it's here. The bear, it's in the yard. I can see it." There was a pause on the other end before he spoke. "Okay, Susan, listen to me. Don't go outside. Stay inside and lock all the doors. I'm on my way, but I need you to stay calm. I'll be there in 15 minutes. Just hold tight." I pressed the phone to my ear, not sure if I was even breathing. The bear was too close, too visible now. My eyes were fixed on the movement in the trees, my hands clammy against the glass, as I tried to get a better look. It was larger than I remembered, its dark form looming, barely concealed by the foliage. It had paused, its head swiveling from side to side as if searching for something. My heart thudded in my chest, the noise deafening in the stillness. I backed away from the window, my breath shallow. My mind raced. I couldn't just stay here, couldn't sit idly by waiting for it to come closer. But I also knew there was nothing I could do. I wasn't armed. I wasn't prepared. I had nothing to protect myself. The only thing I could do was wait for Joe. Seconds felt like hours. I moved through the house, locking every window, securing every door, trying to control the panic that was rising in my chest. The bear wasn't just outside, it was on my property. It had come too close, and this time, I didn't know if I could survive it. The sound of tires crunching on gravel echoed through the silence, and I rushed to the door, my heart leaping in my chest. I opened it just as Joe's truck pulled into the driveway. Relief washed over me as I saw him climb out, his boots hitting the ground with purpose. He didn't waste any time. "Susan, stay inside," he called over his shoulder, as he made his way toward the yard. "I'll handle this." I nodded but didn't move from the doorway, my eyes still locked on the trees. I could barely make out the bear now, the dark shape almost hidden by the thick underbrush. It was still there, still watching. Joe moved, quickly, his flashlight scanning the trees as he called out to the bear. "Hey, get back!" His voice was firm, commanding. He raised a flare gun, the flare shooting out with a bright, piercing light. The bear didn't move at first, only watching Joe with an eerie calm. My stomach tightened as I held my breath, hoping against hope that it would just leave. But then, without warning, the bear let out a low growl, a sound so deep, so guttural, that it sent a chill down my spine. The ground beneath me seemed to vibrate with the force of it. The bear began to move toward Joe, its massive form stepping forward, each movement deliberate. I could hear its breath, ragged and low, as it neared. Him. Joe didn't flinch. He stood his ground, the flare gun raised in front of him. "Back off!" he shouted, his voice filled with authority. "Go back to the woods. This is your last warning." The bear stopped, its eyes locked on Joe. For a moment, the two of them were locked in a strange, tense standoff, man against beast. I could see the muscles in the bear's shoulders ripple as it shifted its weight, its eyes narrowing in a challenge. My heart pounded in my chest, every instinct screaming at me to run, to hide. But I stayed still, too terrified to move. Then, the bear made its decision. With a grunt, it turned and lumbered back into the trees, its large frame disappearing into the thick undergrowth. Joe lowered the flare gun and slowly turned toward me, his face set with a mixture of relief and concern. "It's gone for now," he said, his voice low. "But we can't let our guard down. I'm going to stay here for a bit. Keep an eye on things. You should go inside, lock the doors and stay there. I'll make sure it's not coming back." I nodded, too shaken to say anything. My knees were weak as I stepped back into the house, closing the door behind me. I locked it with trembling hands and pressed my back to it, trying to steady my breathing. I had survived, again, but the fear was still there, gnawing at me. It wasn't over. The bear was still out there. It had come back once more, and it would come back again. There was no escaping it. Not the bear, not the fear. I had to live with it, live in constant uncertainty, because I had no choice. Joe stayed outside for the next few hours, patrolling the property with his flashlight, making sure the bear didn't return. Every so often, he would check in, his voice reassuring through the phone, but I couldn't shake the feeling of helplessness. I had no way of stopping it. By the time morning came, the bear hadn't returned. The night had been quiet again, but I knew it wouldn't be the last time I saw those eyes. It wasn't a matter of if, it was when, and I wasn't sure if I was ready for the next encounter. The days bled into one another. Every morning I woke with the same knot in my stomach, the same sense of impending doom that followed me through every hour. The bear hadn't been back since that night when it came so close, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was only a matter of time before it returned. It was always lurking, always just outside my door, waiting for the right moment to strike again. I had tried to keep going about my days, even ventured into the garden a few times, but every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, made my heart race. I had even gone so far as to bring the trail cameras closer to the house, positioning them along the edge of the yard, hoping to get some kind of reassurance. It was a feeble attempt at peace, but it was the best I could do. Joe had kept his word. He came by every few days to check on me, making sure I was still all right. But even his visits couldn't ease the tension in the air. The silence between us had become a strange thing. We didn't talk about the bear much anymore, as if acknowledging its existence would somehow make it more real, but neither of us could ignore it completely. That afternoon, as I sat by the window, my mind drifting as it often did, I saw something that stopped my breath in my chest. A shadow moving at the edge of the trees, not the usual wind-blown sway of branches, but a distinct figure. Something large. I stood up so quickly that the chair tipped over, but I barely noticed as I rushed to the door. My heart was hammering in my chest, and my hands shook as I reached for the handle. The house felt suddenly too small, too confined. I needed to know what was out there. I needed to face it. As I stepped onto the porch, I saw it more clearly. A large, dark shape moving slowly through the trees, just at the edge of my property. I held my breath, trying to focus. It wasn't as close as the last time, but it was definitely bigger than any deer or coyote I had ever seen. I grabbed my phone, my hands still trembling as I dialed Joe's number. The phone rang twice before he picked up. "Susan." Joe's voice was calm, but I could hear the underlying tension in it. What's going on? It's back, I whispered, almost too afraid to speak. I can see it, the bear, it's in the yard again. Joe's voice shifted immediately, dropping any semblance of casualness. Stay inside, Susan. Lock the doors, don't go out there. I'll be there as soon as I can. I hung up without responding, already moving to close the door. My heart was racing again. The bear was closer this time, its dark form so clearly visible through the trees. It hadn't made any noise yet, but I could feel its presence. I could feel it watching me, even though I couldn't see its eyes. I locked the door behind me, my movements automatic, and then I moved toward the kitchen, my gaze constantly drifting back toward the window. I needed to see it, needed to know it was real, that I wasn't imagining it. I pressed my face to the glass, peering into the fading light. The bear was still there, a hulking silhouette moving through the underbrush. I didn't know how long it had been there or how long it would stay. I couldn't breathe. It was as though the world had gone still again, and all I could focus on was the movement in the trees. Minutes felt like hours, but then I heard it. Tire tracks on the gravel outside. The sound of Joe's truck pulling up. The relief that washed over me was almost dizzying. I stepped back from the window, my legs unsteady as I made my way to the front door. Joe was out of the truck before it even stopped moving, his boots hitting the gravel as he quickly approached the porch. "Stay inside," he ordered, his tone sharp as he scanned the yard, his eyes locked onto the trees where the bear had been moments ago. "It's still out there," I said, my voice shaking. "I can see it moving." Joe's gaze flickered to the trees, and he quickly motioned for me to stay back. "Lock up, I'm going to check it out." I hesitated. The instinct to protest, to beg him to stay, rose in my throat, but I swallowed it down. I didn't want to appear weak, and I didn't want to seem like I couldn't handle it, but I couldn't help it. I was scared. I was terrified, and the worst part was, I wasn't sure what was worse, the fear of the bear, or the fear of being left alone with it. Joe didn't waste any time. He stepped into the yard, his movements deliberate, purposeful. I watched him from the window, my breath shallow. My hands were pressed against the glass, my heart pounding as I saw him approach the tree line. The bear was still there, but it wasn't moving much now. It had stopped and was looking around, its head swiveling from side to side, as if aware of Joe's presence. I could hear the low growl now, deep and rumbling from the depths of the bear's chest. My stomach clenched as I saw Joe take another step closer. I didn't know what to do. I wanted to scream, to call out to him, but I knew that wouldn't help. The bear wouldn't listen to me. And Joe, he was trained for this. He knew what he was doing, but the fear didn't let up. It felt like everything was moving too slowly, like the air was thick with it, suffocating me. Joe raised his voice, calling out to the bear, "Hey, get back. You don't want to do this." I held my breath, watching as the bear seemed to freeze, its body tensing. It was sizing him up, and for a moment I feared it would charge. I didn't know what was going to happen next, but then, surprisingly, the bear began to retreat. Slowly, cautiously, it backed away, moving deeper into the forest. Joe didn't move immediately. He stood there watching the bear retreat, his eyes never leaving the dark shape. Finally, when the bear was gone, Joe lowered his flashlight and turned back toward the house. "All right," he said, walking toward the porch. His face was calm, but there was a weariness in his eyes. "It's gone for now, but we can't. Let our guard down. You're safe inside, all right? Stay there, keep the doors locked." I nodded, my legs still shaky as I stepped back into the house. I wanted to say something, anything, but my mouth felt dry, and the words wouldn't come. I didn't know how to describe what had just happened. The fear, the adrenaline, the raw terror. I didn't know if I was ever going to feel safe again. Joe stayed for a while longer, checking the perimeter once more and ensuring everything was as secure as it could be. But when he left, there was nothing left to say. The bear was gone for now, but I knew it would return. It always did. And the next time I wasn't sure I'd be ready. The next few days were a blur. I tried to push through the fear, trying to go about my routine, but it was harder now. Every noise, every change in the air felt like a warning. The bear was still out there, I was sure of it. Even though it hadn't been seen in a while, I knew it was only a matter of time before it returned. I felt like I was always waiting for something to happen, but I couldn't prepare myself for it. I spent most of my time indoors, trying to get through the days, trying to ignore the tension that had settled into my bones. The house felt smaller, like the walls were closing in on me, and when I did go outside, it was only for the shortest moments. just long enough to check the mail or grab something from the garden. The bear's presence still hung over me, and I couldn't escape the feeling that I was being watched. It was a late afternoon when the knock came. I had just returned inside after watering the plants, my feet sore from the small task that felt monumental these days. My mind was still spinning with thoughts of the bear when I heard it. A knock at the door. A knock that didn't belong to any of my neighbors. I froze, staring at the door as my heart skipped a beat. Who could it be, and why didn't they call first? I didn't want to answer. I didn't want to see anyone, not like this. But after a moment I forced myself to walk to the door, every step heavy with uncertainty. When I opened it, I found Joe standing there. His face was tired, a mixture of concern and something deeper in his eyes. He didn't say anything at first, just looked at me for a long moment as if trying to gauge what I was feeling. "Joe," I said, trying to hide the tension in my voice, "what are you doing here?" He stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. His eyes flicked over the room, taking in the details that I hadn't noticed myself. The disarray, the quiet. "I've been keeping an eye on the trail cameras," Joe said after a pause, his voice unusually somber. "And I got a report from the rangers. The bear was seen again. It's moving this way." I felt a cold rush of fear, a wave that froze me where I stood. I had been bracing myself for something like this, but hearing it out loud was different. The bear was coming back. "How close?" My voice sounded distant, detached, as if I were hearing the words from somewhere far away. "Closer than we thought. Not far off, Susan," Joe said, his tone more serious than I'd ever heard it. "I'm going to stay with you tonight. We'll make sure everything's locked up tight, and I'm going to keep watch for a while." I didn't know what to say. I was still processing the fact that it wasn't over, that I wasn't safe yet. I wasn't sure I'd ever feel safe again. Joe turned to face me, his eyes softer now, though there was still a certain urgency to him. "Listen, we can't let this go on much longer. If it comes here again, we have to take more serious steps. It's not just about scaring it off. We need to think about what to do next. But for tonight I'll keep watch. You don't have to be alone." The thought of being alone again was enough to make my chest tighten. I had been so afraid these last few days, each passing hour a struggle to stay composed. And now that Joe was here, I realized just how much I had relied on his presence to keep my own sanity intact. "Thank you," I said, my voice thick with gratitude. "I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't come." Joe didn't respond right away. Instead, he moved to the window and pulled the blinds aside, scanning the yard. "You should stay inside. I'll keep the cameras going and I'll take a look outside every hour or so. But don't worry about the details right now, you've been through enough." I nodded, though the knot in my stomach wouldn't loosen. I watched him move around the house, double-checking the doors, ensuring that every window was locked. Every click of the locks, every turn of the bolt, seemed to reinforce the fact that we were preparing for something we didn't want to happen. I didn't know how much time had passed when Joe called me over. "You might want to see this," he said, his voice low. I moved toward him, my feet dragging as I approached the window. He pointed to the far side of the yard, where the trees met the edge of the property. My eyes strained in the growing darkness, and I saw it, just barely, an enormous dark shape, shifting in the shadows. "It's here," Joe said, his voice taut. "Stay back. Don't make any noise." My breath caught in my throat as I stared at the bear. It wasn't moving quickly, but it was clear it was coming toward the house. The low growls reached my ears, sending a cold shiver down my spine. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, and I fought to keep myself still, to keep my mind focused. Joe stepped back from the window, his movements deliberate and calm, as if he had done this many times before. He pulled out his radio, his voice a low murmur as he spoke to the rangers. "It's in the yard. We need backup." He turned to me then, his eyes serious. "I need to go to the back room, Susan. Stay there. Don't come out unless I tell you to. I'll handle this." I wanted to argue, to ask him to let me stay, but I knew better. The bear was dangerous, and Joe had experience with this kind of thing. I didn't have the strength or the ability to protect myself if the bear came any closer, so I nodded, though my feet felt like they were made of lead. I moved toward the back of the house, my body moving on its own. I could hear the bear's growls more clearly now, the deep rumbling vibrations making the walls of the house shake. The sound felt like it was coming from inside me, like the fear was alive and clawing its way out. I didn't want to be in the back room. I didn't want to be isolated, hiding while Joe faced the bear alone. But I had no choice. I had to trust him. Hours passed in agonizing silence. I could hear Joe moving around outside, his steps quick but measured, as though he was trying to avoid drawing attention. My phone buzzed once, twice, but I didn't want to look at it. I didn't want to see any news or updates about the bear. The less I knew, the better. It felt like an eternity before I finally heard Joe's voice on the other side of the door. "It's gone," he said, his voice strained but steady. "For now." I opened the door slowly, my heart still in my throat. Joe stood there, his face pale but determined. He didn't look tired, but I could see the exhaustion in his eyes. "The Rangers will be here soon," he said, his voice quiet. "We need to talk about next steps, but you're safe now." For the first time in days, I allowed myself to breathe, to let the tension slip away. But even as I did, I knew it wouldn't be the last time. The bear would return. It always did. And the question wasn't if, it was when. The following days passed in a blur, a haze of fear and exhaustion, as I waited for something to change, for something to happen. I had tried to return to a semblance of normalcy, but each step forward only felt like I was walking through thick mud. Every creak of the floorboards, every snap of a twig, sent me back to the edge where the bear was never too far away in my mind. Joe came by every couple of days to check in, and he'd leave with reassurances that I was doing the right thing, by staying vigilant. But no matter how many times he told me the bear was likely to move on, no matter how many times I saw that glimmer of hope in his eyes, it didn't quiet the storm that raged inside me. The bear wasn't gone. It was simply waiting. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon on the 10th day when I felt the shift. It wasn't a sound or a movement this time. It was a change in the air. The tension in my chest grew heavier, as the night seemed to deepen faster than usual. I had been sitting at the kitchen table, staring out at the yard, when I saw it, the flash of dark fur moving at the edge of the trees. My breath caught in my throat, and my pulse quickened. The sea. Bear, it was back. I jumped up from the chair, my legs weak beneath me. My mind raced, trying to process what I was seeing, but it was too clear. The bear was there, just beyond the trees, its massive form barely visible in the twilight. I scrambled for my phone, dialing Joe's number without thinking, my fingers trembling. The phone rang only once before he picked up. "Susan?" Joe's voice was calm, but I could hear the familiar edge of concern beneath it. "What's going on?" "It's back," I whispered, my voice barely audible, the words catching in my throat. "I can see it again, moving near the trees. It's close, too close." "Okay, stay inside, lock the doors." "I'm on my way," Joe said, his voice steady and reassuring. "I'm coming right now, don't go outside." I barely heard him as I dropped the phone back onto the counter, my mind already racing. The bear wasn't just outside. It was getting closer. Every time it came closer, and I couldn't keep running forever. I moved instinctively, locking the door behind me and checking every window. The sounds of the night seemed to heighten, as if the world were holding its breath, waiting. I could hear my own heartbeat thumping in my ears, my hands shaking as I tried to steady myself. The minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Every second was an eternity, every small movement outside a potential threat. I didn't know how long I could stay inside like this, afraid of what might happen next. But I didn't have any other choice. The bear was right there. Finally, the familiar sound of tires on gravel reached my ears. Joe had arrived. I moved quickly to the front door, opening it just as I saw him step out of the truck, his eyes scanning the yard. He looked determined, but there was a sharp edge to his expression that told me everything I needed to know. He was taking this seriously. "Stay inside, Susan," Joe called as he moved toward the yard, his flashlight already raised. "I've got this. Stay by the door and don't go out." I nodded silently, my throat tight as I backed away. From the door, my eyes locked on him. He moved with purpose, sweeping the beam of his flashlight across the yard and trees. I could see his silhouette against the dimming light as he surveyed the area, every step calculated. The bear was still out there. I could feel it even though I couldn't see it anymore. Joe knew it too, the way he moved, the way his eyes darted from shadow to shadow. It was clear he wasn't taking any chances. I stood by the door, my hands gripped tightly around the handle as I watched him. Minutes passed and the tension between us seemed to grow thicker. The night felt so still, so silent, except for the occasional crack of branches and the soft rustle of leaves. But underneath, at all, the unease was palpable. I wasn't sure if the bear was still out there or if I was just imagining things. "Joe?" I called out softly, my voice betraying my fear. "Are you sure it's gone? I don't know if I can keep doing this." Joe turned back toward me, his face set with grim determination. "We're taking the right steps." We're making sure it doesn't get too close. I won't let it come any further." He paused for a moment, his eyes lingering on mine. "But I understand how you're feeling. I get it. This is a lot to handle. I'm not going to leave you alone until I know for sure it's safe." His words offered a small measure of comfort, but the fear still gripped me. How could I ever feel safe again? How could I keep living like this, always watching, always waiting for the next attack? "I know you're scared," Joe continued, his voice softer now, but still firm. "But I'm here. You're not alone in this." I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. It was hard to admit how much I had relied on him, how much I needed him to help keep the fear at bay. But I wasn't foolish enough to think that he could solve this on his own. The bear was out there, and there was only so much we could do to keep it at bay. Joe turned away from the door, scanning the yard once more. "Stay put," he said. "I'm going to check around the back of the house." I watched him disappear around the corner of the house, the sound of his footsteps, muffled by the dark. For a few moments I stood there, my eyes glued to the window, praying that the bear was gone, that we had finally scared it off for good. But deep down, I knew it wasn't over. Not yet. The seconds dragged on, but there was no movement. The yard seemed to hold its breath, as if the world was waiting for something to break the silence. I heard the crunch of gravel underfoot. Joe was returning. He stepped back into view, his face set with a tense frown. "It's not gone," he said, his voice low. "It's circling the house. We need to stay alert." A chill ran through me, the tension building in my chest. "What do we do now?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "We stay inside," Joe said, his eyes never leaving the darkness. "We keep monitoring the cameras, stay vigilant. We've got to wait for the bear to leave, and if it doesn't, well, we'll take further steps."